Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Molly Miller-Mons, and I am the Interim Director of Philanthropy at the ACLU of Minnesota. I'm honored to welcome you to the final of 4 conversations where we explore the intersection between women's rights and racial justice. The series title, Advancing Women's Equality, Confronting Barriers to Full Inclusion in Progress, has been designed and will be moderated by Professor Michele Goodwin. Today's conversation will center on advancing women's equality. What's next? It will focus on women and the communities adjacent to their lives while tackling the most urgent issues of our times. A nationally recognized advocate for civil liberties and civil rights, Professor Goodwin is the Chancellor's Chair in Law at the University of California, Irvine School of Law. She is an elected member of the American Law Institute, as well as an elected fellow of the American Bar Foundation. Her most recent book, Policing the Womb, Invisible Women and the Criminalization of Motherhood, is available at your local bookstore or library. Professor Goodwin serves on the Executive Committee and National Board of the American Civil Liberties Union and is a member of the ACLU Minnesota's Board of Directors. For nearly 70 years, the ACLU of Minnesota has fought to protect the civil liberties of Minnesotans. We are a nonpartisan organization. Our client is the Constitution, not one particular view. All the topics discussed today, women's rights, voting rights, immigration, and racial justice, are all issues that ACLU has been tackling since its founding. To learn more and to support the work of the ACLU of Minnesota, please visit our website, www.aclu-mn.org. Thank you again for joining us, and a huge thank you to Professor Goodwin for designing and moderating this engaging and thought-provoking series.
Thank you very much for that, Molly. I am so absolutely delighted to be joined by our guests today. They're really quite extraordinary, and our viewing audience on YouTube and also on this platform have been able to see through the PowerPoint slide who they are, but I'm going to just briefly share with you who we have with us today. We are joined by the outstanding Barbara Arnwine. She is the president and founder of Transformative Justice Coalition and former executive director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. We're also joined by Susan Herman, past president of the American Civil Liberties Union, who served in that capacity for more than 12 years. She is the Ruth Bader Ginsburg Professor of Law at Brooklyn Law School. We will also be joined by C.K. Hoffler, president of the National Bar Association. And then also, so pleased that Dr. Julie Suk is joining us. She's a professor of sociology, political science, and liberal studies at the Graduate Center of the City of University of New York, and the Florence Rogatz visiting professor of law and senior research scholar at Yale Law School. During the time of this 4-part series, there's much that we've had to think about, from matters of mass incarceration and policing to matters that engage the intersections of those and matters of race and also sex and social justice and socioeconomics. And today we're asking the question about what's next in advancing women's equality, and we're revisiting those topics and more. Between this time and our last meeting together with the audience of people who've participated, we have seen absolutely horrific acts of violence, gun violence in our country, gun violence associated with hate, gun violence associated with the gunning down of Asian American and women of Asian descent in Atlanta, Georgia. We have seen the legislators in Georgia and the governor sign into law voter suppression legislation. The issues of immigration and immigration reform are still on the table. And in the backdrop of all of this, we have the trial of Officer Chauvin taking place, and that connection both to Minnesota and, of course, the death of George Floyd. So there's much for us to talk about in what we're calling a fireside chat, maybe without the fireplace. And I actually want to level set this conversation, starting off with you, Julie, Dr. Suk. Julie, can you tell us about why your research is concerned women in leadership? What have we learned from women's attempts and successes in advancing their leadership? Why does it matter when some would say that, look, men can speak to women's issues as well as women can? So why the push for greater recognition of women and greater presence of women in government, in organizations such as those where these women are leading, and more. So level set for us.
Thank you so much, Michele. We're at an unprecedented moment in our nation's constitutional history because the Equal Rights Amendment, which women have been making and trying to get into the Constitution for about 100 years, is at a pivotal moment. Although the Equal Rights Amendment that was adopted by Congress in the 1970s was 3 states short of ratification then, in recent years, 3 additional states have ratified, and just 2 weeks ago in Congress, there was a vote to remove its deadline so that it could be added to the Constitution. And I emphasize this because we've gotten to that point because of the unstoppable work of women in Congress and state legislatures. We're at an all-time high of women in Congress right now at roughly 25 or 26%. And on the one hand, while we're very proud of that achievement, that we have more women in Congress than ever before, it's actually far less than the percentage of women in many of our peer democracies. And if you just look at, many people might wonder, why has the Equal Rights Amendment taken this long to get close to being added to the Constitution? A simple answer is that we have a Constitution that requires a tremendous supermajority in Congress, that is 2/3 of Congress and 3/4 of state legislatures to make an amendment. And if you think about that 2/3 number, we don't even have enough women right now in Congress to block a constitutional amendment. You would need 1/3. And 26% is still a little bit less than that. And I think the journey by which women have sought their constitutional inclusion is one that could not have happened without the leadership of women of color in Congress in the 1970s, women like Patsy Mink and Shirley Chisholm, and the fierce leadership of women of color, especially African-American women in the 3 state legislatures, Nevada, Illinois, and Virginia, that most recently ratified it. And I think that making their achievements official is a very important pivot point for solidifying the gains and moving ahead so that beyond just prohibiting discrimination, we can actually make democracy a place where women are full and equal participants. And we could just look to the rest of the world to see how women in leadership has made a difference to the handling of the pandemic and so many other crises that are going to confront us in the future.
Thank you so much for that. And we actually should come back to that in terms of thinking about women in leadership and the pandemic. Because as we think about women leaders around the world, from Germany to New Zealand, it's a very different approach a year ago to handling the pandemic. Quite different than in the United States, where leadership called it a hoax, that it was no different than the common flu, while there were tens of thousands of people dying. And, as I think about that, just within the first few months of the pandemic last year in the United States, there were more Americans who had died than in all of Americans who had died during the Vietnam War, right? In the first few months in the US of COVID, we had over 100,000 people dead. In the Vietnam War, over 19 years, that was about 59,000 people. And so I appreciate you mentioning that, and we may come back to that because that is also the backdrop in which we're having this conversation. And Susan, I want to turn to you. You were the president of the American Civil Liberties Union. Some people would say that there is a conflict between civil rights and civil liberties. I'd like to hear your response to that. But as well, you've had to be involved with some very tough decision making at the top of the helm. And that has included the ACLU, how would one call it, waiving its own policy in issuing statements for the impeachment of Donald Trump. So I want for you to address that with this audience. But before we do, I'd like for us to see a clip from the Senate committee as it was pursuing the question of the prosecution of the president. Can you play the clip?
Think about it. What will the January exception mean to future generations if you grant it? I'll show you.
We will stop the steal. Today I will lay out just some of the evidence proving that we won this election, and we won it by a landslide. This was not a close election. And after this, we're going to walk down, and I'll be there with you. We're going to walk down. We're going to walk down to the Capitol.
Yeah! Let's take the Capitol. Take the Capitol. Take the Capitol. We are going to the Capitol, where our problems are. It's that direction. Everybody in! This way! This way!
Tens of thousands of votes. They came in duffel bags. Where the hell did they come from?
Madam Speaker, the Vice President, and the United States Senate.
Off the sidewalk.
Stand up for him! Stand up for him! We outnumber you a million to one out here, dude!
Take the building! Take the building! Fuck these guys. Join us! That's enough! There's much more coming!
The Constitution says you have to protect our country, and you have to protect our Constitution. And you can't vote on fraud. And fraud breaks up everything, doesn't it? When you catch somebody in a fraud, you're allowed to go by very different rules. So I hope Mike has the courage to do what he has to do.
Talk about you,
And we fight. We fight like hell. And if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore.
So, Susan, the ACLU issued a statement supporting the impeachment of Donald Trump. Why did the ACLU do this, and what was the strategy behind it, or the framing of the support for impeachment?
Okay, Michelle, I'll say a couple of things about that. You know, it's so painful to watch that clip again, isn't it?
It is.
So what happened, the ACLU, as many of you probably know, has affiliates, you know, all around the country, including Minnesota, of course, and our DC affiliate really took the lead in reacting to the events of January 6th. And since we're talking about advancing women's leadership, I thought you might like to know that the executive director of that affiliate, Monica Hopkins, is a woman, as is their national board representative, Heidi Tsu. And so they were very passionate in bringing to the national board the fact that they wanted to invoke our policy. We have a policy on impeachment because, as Molly was saying before, for the last 100 years, one of the ACLU's watchwords has been nonpartisanship. We do not support or oppose candidates for either elective or appointed office. However, we do have a policy on impeachment that requires a supermajority vote of the board and a finding by the board that there is an emergency to civil liberties. And the way that we framed our reaction to that was in terms of the utter contempt for the rule of law, and that, you know, to have Donald Trump in office and to not make a statement that this challenge, you know, this insurrection at the Capitol was an impeachable offense. It was just, you know, not possible. So we had a special emergency meeting and the board voted that. The other thing I want to comment on, though, given what Julie and Michelle were both saying, was that another major theme here that I think is, you know, also concerning is how the policing was done of the insurrection at the Capitol. Many people pointed out at the time that the fact that the rioters were just allowed to run around and do whatever they wanted, and that there was so little accountability, is something that would not have happened if this had been a Black Lives Matter protest. But the other connection I want to draw, because the ACLU's founding was in 1920, and there was a heavy connection between the people who founded the ACLU and the people who were suffragists working for suffrage, is that my early vision of people outside the Capitol who were heavily policed were the women who were picketing. They were picketing Woodrow Wilson. They wanted him to support the 19th Amendment, which he was not. And they were holding up signs asking how he could be fighting World War I to make the world safe for democracy when half of the people in the United States could not vote. Now, a lot of people are not aware of this part of history, but those women were treated brutally. They were arrested, they were manhandled, they were interrogated. Some of them went on a hunger strike in jail. So it was kind of an important part of women coming to power. So I just wanted to make that note, Michele, in addition to the ACLU's reaction to the need to support the impeachment of Donald Trump, there was also this whole sense of the history's reaction to protest and the idea that protest should be equally available to everybody and equally policed, for everybody.
Mm-hmm. Well, Susan, and to our audience, we've said that this is an intimate conversation. One of the things that I thought in seeing the footage that emerged that night on January 6th was of the Black and brown cleaning crew that was in the Capitol, cleaning up all of the broken glass that had been left by those who stormed and insurrected at the Capitol. And it is poignant and powerful what you say. And I think that if there had been any group of color, I can't imagine if there had been Muslim Americans who had stormed the Capitol, Asian Americans who somehow amassed, in that level of violence and vitriol who stormed the Capitol. I can't imagine any groups of people of color in the United States that wouldn't have left in squad cars, police wagons, SWAT teams showing up to get them out of that building. And the fact that this was the first time that the Confederate flag had actually made its way to our nation's Capitol building, I think really says a lot. So thank you so much for sharing that, Susan. I actually want to come back later to the sort of commentary about the ACLU and its founding, as it was an organization that was founded by women, including Helen Keller and others. But since we've been talking about women and leadership and transformative matters, Barbara, I'd like to bring you in here to share a bit about what we see as a backdrop with regard to voting. That is to say that so many have credited, and Julie started us off with talking about the ERA and women of color with voting rights. And Julie, I want to give a shout out to your book, We the Women, the Unstoppable Mothers of the Equal Rights Amendment. But we've seen horrible things happening, Barbara, with regard to the fight against these women who are trying to expand voting rights. And maybe it's not even expanding voting rights, it's just make sure that people have the right to vote. Can you tell us about what's going on and help people to understand what's taking place in Georgia?
Well, what we're seeing in Georgia is a backlash to our success. It's a backlash to the fact that African Americans, Latinos, Asians, Native Americans, and young voters turned out in record numbers and participated in a COVID election by participating, by voting by mail, by absentee balloting, by actually a whole lot of people showing up to polls. In fact, in Georgia, a little bit less than 70% of all voters actually voted in person. But there was over 1 million who voted by absentee balloting. And so all of a sudden, when we had this double turnout in record numbers for November 3rd and on January 6th for the Senate runoffs, all of a sudden the legislature started losing its mind. In fact, they lost their mind after November 3rd. They tried to have an emergency session of the state legislature in late November and early December because they wanted to ban drop boxes. They wanted to impose new voter ID requirements. They wanted to, to get rid of, all kinds of, accessibility to the ballot box. And fortunately, they did not go into session. But as soon as they could, they did. On the other side of the calendar when we were into 2021. And not surprisingly, they have rushed through. I mean, they violated every calendar rule they got to rush through what now is called, SB 202, which is wicked, folks. I mean, if you want to just look at some evil, and I'm not talking about just technical stuff. I'm talking about absolutely evil intended.
Well, we're talking about people not being able to even provide water.
They don't even, listen, they said that if you try to provide water or food to somebody standing in line, that you will be arrested. That it is a criminal offense, not just you're going to get some citation. They're taking you to jail for trying to feed people. Now, guess what they didn't do? What they didn't do was make sure that they had more polling sites so they wouldn't have long lines. I mean, they had options here, right? But instead they passed all these ugly rules, getting rid of Sunday souls to the polls voting, except for, quote, some discretion within the counties. People, there are 159 counties in Georgia. When they had, quote, discretionary voting during one Saturday of the runoffs, only 11 counties out of 159 had that discretionary Saturday. So all of this is gamesmanship. All of this is designed to really block Black, Latino, Asian vote and young voters. They hate them. I mean, and it's just, they banned, they made it so drop boxes can only be in governmental buildings during the hours of operations of the Board of Elections. What's the purpose of a drop box? Is to be able to drop your ballot in at your convenience when you're off work, which is when those buildings are closed. I mean, it's just vicious what they're doing. And people got to understand that this is not by accident. It's not because there's anything. They brought into Donald Trump's big lie and used the big lie to create the big block, to make sure that they blocking voters. What we're looking at is a new America that's called we're a democracy and justice for some, not for all. So if we allow that to happen, it would be a tragedy. And I want us to call on the strength of the women that have come before us, who fought through all the other, blocks, all the other fights. And we got to call on their strength. And what we're saying is on May 8th, we're having a national mobilization. We're calling on people throughout this country to show up and show out, because it's time to pass Senate Bill 1 that would stop a lot of this nonsense, and to pass HR 4. We got it, which is the John Lewis, beautiful John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. We got to get those things done. This is our generation. This is what's our requirements.
So what's sad about this is that this is more than centuries old, right? This isn't just 1965 Voting Rights Act old. This is 15th Amendment old, right?
And it's not just Georgia.
This is the point. It's not just Georgia. And we're going to come back to that, because, what really, for me, struck at the heart of this, there's so many aspects of it that's just wrong. But to think about individuals with disabilities, elderly individuals, who have had to wait in line for hours. We're not talking about, 90 minutes. We're talking about lines that are 7 hours, 8 hours, and to have to wait then to get a sip of water. I mean, to me, that just, spoke to, I just hear antebellum stuff, right? Like, it just makes me, it just gives me that sense, especially given that those images of the people who we see across this country waiting in line like that happen to be Black and brown. So, all right. So we've started just a little bit about women in leadership, the importance of, women protest and what that means, women bringing great ideas, new ideas to the table. Susan, I'm going to come back to you about the founding of the ACLU, but it's also matters of exclusion that are about how people of color create their own. And so, CK, thank you so much for joining us. I know you have a very busy schedule, so I'm really happy that you're with us. And you're the president of the National Bar Association. And when I think about the National Bar Association, its very kind of rise comes out of this space of exclusion. And now you're a woman leading this organization. So level set for us and tell us about the organization and why it needed the origin story that it has.
You're muted.
You're muted.
Thank you so
CK.
much. Am I still muted?
You're good.
You're good.
I'm good? Okay. So Michele, thank you so much for having me. I apologize for being late. I went from one Zoom to another Zoom. You know, we're dealing with this tragedy and crisis at Georgetown Law Center, where we had a professor that said some horrific things about all Black students. And so I just left a meeting with the administration there to hear. And so I apologize for being late, but let me just tell you about the National.
It looks like we may have lost
Oh,
CK
no.
for a moment, which is too bad. All right, so we're going to try to get CK back. And while we work on trying to get CK back, Susan, this is an opportunity to turn to you about the origin story of the ACLU, because it was also
origins. The National Bar. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you now, CK. Let's see if we got you.
Okay. Well, it's the weather is horrific in Atlanta.
Oh.
Absolutely horrific. And so I'm sitting here in my car with rain pouring and everything, but it was important for me to be here. So let me speak quickly.
And we just lost CK again, which is too bad. I mean, it's sort of the beauty of Zoom is that we get to be together. And then the tragedy of it is that we also lose great people. So we're going to work on that. So I'm going to ask our team to work with CK on that so that we can hear her. And in the meantime, Susan, if you can tell us about the ACLU's origin story, because, you know, what one hears from time to time is that the real civil libertarians don't include people of color and don't include women. I always find that interesting too, when people say, well, you know, we need to recruit real civil libertarians to an issue. And I think about the ACLU's founding and the people who've been with the ACLU. So can you fill in some of the blanks?
Thanks, Michele. I developed my own version of the ACLU origin story during last year, which was our centennial, where I was researching the woman who I think should get credit for the very idea of the ACLU, Crystal Eastman, who I'm sure Julie knows about. Crystal was a pacifist and a suffragist and everything else. She's an amazing woman, but she was running the predecessor organization of the ACLU, which was essentially an anti-war organization. And in 1917, when the United States joined World War I, it became impossible to be a vocal anti-war organization because people, including Crystal's brother Max, were being prosecuted for sedition, for saying things. So Crystal's idea was to pivot and to start what she called a National Civil Liberties Bureau, and to say, oh, well, we're defending people who speak out against the war and conscientious objectors because it's a matter of their First Amendment freedoms. You know, people should be allowed to say unpopular things. So that was her concept. However, Crystal did not become the director of the National Civil Liberties Bureau, or the ACLU, which grew out of it, because she was pregnant and she took a maternity leave for 5 minutes, and Roger Baldwin was brought in to replace her. And after that, she went back to work right away. She was very hardworking, but she was marginalized. And when the ACLU was founded in 1920, as you were saying before, there were a lot of women involved in the founding committee, including Jeanette Rankin, the first woman in Congress, and Jane Addams and Helen Keller, et cetera, and Crystal Eastman. But Crystal had some different ideas from people at the beginning of the ACLU. And this is a great example, Michele, of your question about why it matters to have women in leadership. Roger Baldwin, who was the founding director and was director for 30 years, was a good man, as was Arthur Garfield Hayes, who was the first counsel. But in 1920, they were influenced by women's groups who did not agree with Crystal's agenda. Crystal, I don't know what Julie makes of this story, but Crystal is credited for co-writing the Equal Rights Amendment with Alice Paul. And in 1920, when a lot of the women's organizations were celebrating that they had won, they had gotten the right to vote, Crystal gave a very famous speech, still on the American rhetoric list of the 100 greatest American speeches of all time. And she called it "Now We Can Begin." And her idea was that getting the right to vote wasn't the victory, it was the opportunity to use political power instead of just the power of organizations to fight for true equality for women. However, at that point, Crystal was not running the ACLU, and the ACLU was listening to the women's groups who did not want to fight for women's equality because they were afraid of losing some very hard-won protectionist legislation. And that was their choice. And so it took 50 years, from 1920 to 1970, for the ACLU to come around and support the Equal Rights Amendment. And I want to comment in terms of women's leadership. You all know about, there's different kinds of leadership in an organization. There's the staff leadership and the board leadership. The reason the ACLU came around was that there were two board members, Dorothy Kenyon and the great Paulie Murray, who in the 1960s pushed the ACLU to get involved in women's rights and to support the Women's Rights Amendment, and 1971, right, to found the Women's Rights Project. So I think this is such an interesting story because the women who were pushing the ACLU to do this were not on the staff. They were on the board, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, of course, was a law professor because when she graduated from law school in 1950, whatever it was, as happened to Crystal when she graduated from law school in 1907, they couldn't get jobs as lawyers. So they had to, come up with Plan B. In order to not tell you more about this fascinating story, I think I'm going to put in the chat a link to the blog post that I wrote about the rest of Crystal's story, which if you don't know it is amazing. But anyway, so I think, Michele, that it's very telling that the ACLU has done some great work. But it took 50 years until they were really including women in the great work. There were occasional women's rights cases. And the story today is completely different in terms of women leaders at the ACLU, which we can talk about if you want to get there. But today, over half the staff are women, half of the EDs, et cetera.
So I really appreciate that level setting, and also the centering the work of Paulie Murray, who unfortunately has been so lost to history. And that when people think about the great Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, they don't understand that decades before there was Paulie Murray, who set the stage both in terms of the articulating the equality strategies that would be used in regard to striking down sex bias laws, as well as the strategies that would be used by Thurgood Marshall and others on the civil rights stage.
Can I interject one thing? Because a lot of people don't know this. Everyone lionizes Ruth Bader Ginsburg, but she didn't want to take all the credit. The first Supreme Court brief that she wrote in Reed versus Reed, on the cover of the brief, she puts on the appearances of counsel Dorothy Kenyon and Paulie Murray. Even though they did not work on that case, but she wanted to credit that she wasn't doing this by herself. And I also want to say that Paulie Murray, it seems to me, was one of the first of the intersectionists. Yes. Although that term wasn't, kind of recognized until later. She used to talk about Jane Crow. Like we always talk about Jim Crow. What about Jane Crow? Absolutely. So I'm so glad that Paulie Murray is finally getting some of her due, as is Crystal Eastman.
Yeah, and if I'll turn to my left or right, I'll hold up a Paulie Murray book that was just on my desk here. And in fact, I want to talk about that intersectionality and ask everybody who's on the call to try to respond. And CK, we're going to try you again to see if we can actually get the audio working, because it is another version of an intersectional story, you being the president at the NBA, but even its very founding.
Certainly, the NBA was founded in 1925 because Black lawyers were not able to become members of the American Bar Association. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Oh, wonderful, the American Bar Association. And of course, that was very problematic because obviously we felt it important to congregate, important to learn from each other, important to share experiences. This was during segregation. So the NBA was founded, and one of the founding members was Gertrude Rush, a woman, an African-American lawyer. So it was created, and it became a very robust organization because essentially every Black lawyer in America joined the NBA. And now, so if we look at now, almost 100 years later, because we're soon going to celebrate our 100th year anniversary, We represent the interests of almost 66,000 lawyers. This year, we instituted a program where every single BALSA student in the country, actually in the world, any BALSA student is automatically a member of the NBA for free. And so the reason why the NBA is important is because we need, as African-American lawyers, we need organizations such as the NBA and our 80 affiliate chapters that we have throughout the country really to breathe. And I know that sounds dramatic, but we really need it to breathe, because some of the things that we encounter as Black lawyers practicing, and no matter what areas, whether you're a civil rights lawyer or a corporate lawyer or a tax lawyer, or if you handle complex commercial issues, some of the issues that we encounter are really unique to African Americans. And as a Black woman, I will confess, sometimes when I encounter issues, it's hard to say, was this because I was a woman or because I'm Black? But since it's all blended together, all I know is that it's bad and I've got to overcome it. And so that is the essence of the National Bar. Barbara Arnwine, who I could hear, you all couldn't hear me, but I could hear her. She's been my senior advisor for our election protection effort. She's the mother of the election protection movement when she was at the Lawyers Committee on Civil Rights. So it's just an incredible organization that fuels us, that gives us the energy, the strength, and the power to go out and do what I call social justice work, because it's a social justice organization. We've been on the front lines of every fight. We made a tremendous difference in the last round of presidential elections and in the Georgia runoff, the Senate runoff elections, because lawyers were needed to be ready for battle. That is how oppressive the presidential elections and the Georgia Senate runoff elections were. Fortunately, people were able to vote, but it was not without confronting horrific voter suppression. And now I'm here in Atlanta. So when you were talking about those people waiting in line, it took me 5.5 hours to vote in the presidential election. You talk about oppressive. You talk about voter suppression. It should have taken me 10 minutes. And by the way, 10 minutes away from me, it did take people 5 to 10 minutes. So this is real. And with these laws in Georgia, and Georgia is just merely a model for other states in the union. But with these laws, it's going to become increasingly important and difficult, if not impossible, for certain Black and brown people, young and Asian people to vote. And that's the travesty. So we cannot let that happen. And women are leading the charge and making a change.
I'll just thank you so much for that, CK. And I'll just add too, you level set with this with regard to issues that have affected Black lawyers. The same has been true in the medical space as well, hence the founding of the National Medical Association, because Black doctors had been barred from affiliating with the American Medical Association. And interestingly enough, in the late 1800s, when approached about this, the AMA issued statements about the reason why it needed to bar Black physicians is because Black medical schools admitted women. So there's a very interesting way of connecting back here. So let me turn to this question for all of the panelists, which is about what do you experience and what have you experienced as women who talk about leadership, women who are leaders? Is there a different kind of toll or price to pay, do you think, with women coming into leadership positions and being taken seriously with the work that they have to do? And I'll start with you, Barbara.
Yes. I mean, when I first came to DC, it was fascinating. None of the men leaders paid me a bit of attention. Did not welcome me, did not do any of the customary work. And with the women, with the white women, it was also a little bit dicey. So it's been, fascinating that even though I've been in women's leadership for decades, right? The sad news is that you never earn your spot, where people just automatically give you the respect, the inclusion, the leadership, deference does not happen. I mean, you have to keep fighting still for people to recognize, and I am just sick of people stealing my ideas, stealing my thoughts, and presenting them as their own. I've had men lecture me about voter suppression. When I created the map of shame in 2011 and said voter suppression, and people told me to shut up and not talk about that because nobody wanted to hear it. I mean, it is just amazing to watch, what happens to women in leadership. But the beauty of it all has been there were people who were, the one thing, if you're a woman leader, if you're a woman activist, period, you got to surround yourself with some good people. You got to find some affirmative people who will reinforce you, who will lift you in those down times, who will say, hey, that's good, that's brilliant, let's do that. You got to find those people. You don't need all the Debbie Downers and all the, the Adam guys, blockers, all that. You need really beautiful people in your life. And that's what's gotten me through my faith, my spirit, and, gorgeous, friends who have just been there and walked the hard walk, because it's a hard walk to be a woman leader.
And Susan, how would you respond to that? You've led an organization where people, by their very nature, about let's make this happen and let's do this, right? But at the same time, you also led an organization where outside of the organization, maybe within the organization, you had pushback. But you've also had to experience that on the outside too, where there have been people who have said, it's hard to reconcile civil rights with civil liberties, and have called into question whether the ACLU itself cares about things like Black Lives Matter.
Well, first of all, I don't have to tell you the ACLU cares a whole lot about Black Lives Matter. They've been a very prominent client in a lot of places, I believe, including Minnesota. But you could correct me. Hard to keep track of what 50 affiliates are doing all at once. The whole idea of the ACLU, and the reason I've spent all my time at that organization, is that the idea that you can connect the dots between all of our civil liberties and all of our civil rights, I think is an essential idea. And I think the people who ask the question, if we have to choose between our civil rights and our civil liberties, which should we choose? I think that's just the wrong question. The great John Lewis used to say that without First Amendment freedom of speech and freedom of association, the civil rights movement would have been a bird without wings. And so, I think that to me, there's such a strong connection between civil rights and civil liberties. I also want to say, in terms of, just listening to what Barbara was saying about women's leadership, it was a journey for the ACLU to become more inclusive internally, as well as in our external work. And I started in 1920, and then through the Women's Rights Project. Well, today, the board of directors is about half women. The executive directors of our affiliates are about half women, including the great Andrea Young in Georgia, the daughter of Andrew Young, who took the job because she wanted to promote voting rights work. And so she's part of the battle in Georgia. Our board also is 60% people, the national board is 60% people who identify as non-white at this point. And the way that we made that happen, it doesn't just happen. We had all sorts of national policies that require the affiliates, as you well know, Michele, to be sending us representatives who aren't always the same white guys. And we worked very hard on developing different leadership and developing women and a much more diverse pool of leadership, to the point where, as you well know, and maybe everyone else does, my successor, Deborah Archer, is a Black woman. She's the first person of color to be the president of the board. She's now the third woman to be president. And so I think that, I think that my conversation here is sort of in two parts. There's the ACLU internally and what we do about women leadership and promoting intersectional leadership. And then there's our external work. And although, it's complicated sometimes to set priorities, but I think that, Deborah would say the same thing that I do, which is that the ACLU is not going to choose between civil rights and civil liberties.
Wow, that is the statement of now. What about you, CK? Because what you've laid on the table is that the National Bar Association comes from a space where it had to fight for its own identity and space. And yet at the same time, I think there's greater honesty today about the experiences that Black women have, even within the context of Black organizations, and having to fight for a space of their own and respect for the work that they do within their own communities.
Absolutely. What I would say is, well, I'm the 14th woman president of the National Bar Association.
Look at
14th.
that.
I'm I'm the 70th president, but only the 14th woman. And so our struggle continues just period. We have a robust presence at the National Bar. Just as with other bar associations, I dare say we run things. I mean, I just believe that, Barbara. I don't know if you agree, but I do believe that. Certainly we have extraordinary contributions of our male lawyers, but we are in a position now and have been fighting for many years. I stand on the shoulders of some incredible, remarkable African-American women who were presidents before me. But I can tell you, I'm now also the first ever chair of the board of Rainbow Push Coalition. So I say those things because they inform my perspective on this issue. In 1988, I was a first-year associate at a big firm, big law, and we didn't have, Google, we didn't have, the internet and all that. All we had was the phone, which was very expensive if you called internationally, telex, and fax. People don't even know what telex is, and fax. And I had a client in Antigua. I was assigned to this case. I was just so excited. It was magnificent. I was going to travel to Antigua and Barbuda. And I should have known that there was something up when not a single other associate wanted to work on the file, but I digress. So I called the client to introduce myself. I was going to be helping him with some partners were overseeing the case, helping him settle his claims in Antigua. And when I called him to introduce him, I said, oh, and I'm going to be the point person lawyer working on your case. He said, wait a minute, stop. I mean, just rude Bush. What? You're going to be working on my case? And I said, oh, yes. I just thought he couldn't hear me. Yes, I'm going to be working on your case. He said, oh, no. Oh, no. No, and no. I'm going to have to call the senior partners and tell them, I don't believe in women lawyers. Oh. I myself, trial lawyer in Cincinnati, 1988. In Cincinnati, I ran a firm. We never had any women lawyers. I don't believe in women lawyers. And by the way, you're not working on my case. And I'm going to call. He just went on and on. I said, well, please feel free to call. And of course, he called the partners, and I remained on the case, ended up settling his claims and going to Antigua. But when he was saying this,
you still got your vacation.
But when he was saying this on the phone, what occurred to me was, wait until you see me. Because clearly he didn't know I was Black. And when he saw me, he about passed out. Because we had interfaced on the phone and via fax for 3 months. And the greatest the only compliment he gave me, he said it was something like this. Well, I must admit, for a woman and all, I mean, given that you're a woman, I mean, I never thought I'd have to work with a woman lawyer, but given that you're a woman, I suppose I could say, you seem to have a strong handle on my claims. And I interrupted him because after 3 months, I was just tired of his issues. And I said, can we just drop the for a woman thing? Yeah. I said, that's not appropriate. Now, mind you, I'm a first-year associate. So that kind of informs my experience as a woman leader.
And that's
that's it.
So Julie, the first time that I saw you present, Julie, this was years ago at Columbia, and you were presenting a paper about quota systems and how to advance women's leadership and what was taking place around the world, things that we couldn't do. And I want to think about this question domestically and also internationally for you in terms of, what are the impediments to women's leadership? How do we level set here in the United States? I mean, you started us off with talking about a journey that we've not even been able to fulfill yet with regard to the ERA. And if we looked at women in leadership in the United States, we're better than we were, let's say 10 years ago, but we still don't come even close to our peer allies.
I'm going to come back to Paulie Murray because she testified in favor of the ERA in 1970. And as Susan mentioned, she was a very important figure in persuading this shift, many groups that had not supported the Equal Rights Amendment and preferred instead litigation, which was successful under the Equal Protection Clause to include gender equality. Well, when Paulie testified, she said before Congress, the struggle for equal rights is actually a struggle for equal power. And that's how it was different from the litigation strategy, because what was sought was not just doctrinal changes in terms of scrutinizing sex classifications, which they worked on and succeeded with culminating in United States versus Virginia in 1996. They said the ERA is really about equal power, and currently in 1970 we live in a dangerous imbalance, which is to say that there were like 10 or 11 women in Congress out of 535. And if you have that kind of imbalance, abuse of power was the natural next step. And so she said, until we have at least a third of Congress who are women, we're going to be living in what she called a dangerous imbalance, something that threatens the democratic legitimacy of our constitutional order. And I'm sad to say that in 2021, although we have made a lot of progress, we're not even at a third. And she talked about that over 50 years ago.
So do you think that it's been a threat to our democracy, the level at which we are in terms of women's representation in federal and state government?
Yeah, I think it is actually a legitimizing feature that the people who contribute to democracy and have much to contribute to make it better face many structural barriers, not just to voting, but also to getting elected within our system. And many other countries that have done better by adopting laws that require the representation of women on political party candidate lists in elections. I mean, there's also ways that you could design an electoral system using proportional representation rather than a winner-take-all system, so that if you have a quota that applies to a political party, you end up with roughly equal numbers of men and women. And this is very commonly used in many other countries around the world. But this is something that is highly contested here in the United States. So I'll give you an example. Last year, California, or 2018, California adopted a law that requires every corporate board in the state to have at least one woman. And it's being challenged as a violation of the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause, because it's a woman quota and it forces people to pick at least one woman. And so the Ninth Circuit, I mean, it was dismissed on standing grounds, but it's being argued in the Ninth Circuit earlier this month. And so this is where I think we have an understanding that's very formal about what equal protection means. And the Equal Protection Clause itself has been used to scrutinize efforts to promote the equality of disadvantaged and disempowered groups. The Equal Protection Clause is what's been used to strike down affirmative action instead of require affirmative action for the groups that have been disempowered and disfranchised. And this is where I think that constitutional reform of many kinds, including the ERA, could be very helpful. We need to update the Constitution. And so far, we've mostly updated the Constitution by letting judges interpret it. But I think that the people need to be involved in actually updating our 18th century document. And not just the ERA, I think we also need an affirmative voting rights amendment. The 15th Amendment has not done what it really ought to do because of the way that it's been interpreted. And so I think it is time for more of a sense. And this might also mean revisiting the very process by which Article 5 of the Constitution created an amendment rule that arguably was created to entrench the compromise on slavery rather than to allow it to change. And that's why it took so long for it to change. And even when it did change, we still got Jim Crow after that. So I think that we need to have a new conversation in other countries. In Chile right now, they had a plebiscite and they're electing a new constituent assembly that's required to have at least half women, as well as seats for indigenous groups. And so we need a new model of constitutionalism here in the United States as well.
Well, you've actually transitioned us to the last part of our program, and I want to thank all of the people who are joining us via YouTube on this and then also on this platform. And it went by way too quickly, but I want to ask what comes next. So this is the final of 4 programs that have been addressing the issues of women and advancement across areas where we don't think about women belonging or having a space to reflect, including on matters of policing. But we've done that in these programs. I want to end this program with asking about what comes next. What should come next when we think about advancing women's equality and leadership, and as we put everything on the table, from immigration to reproductive health care and rights to matters of racial justice And this will be just a quick clip. So if you can give us, the 40-second answer. I'm going to start off with you, CK. What comes next? What do we need to do?
Well, women need to continue to fight for equality and justice, without a question. The struggle continues. We've got to fight to be included. We have to fight to be incorporated at high levels, whether it's in corporate America, whether it's in government, whether it's the public sector, private sector. We have to fight for inclusion because we are on the front lines of every issue that this country faces. So we've got to just keep fighting, pushing, opening up the doors, going through glass ceilings, and refusing to be denied.
Wow, you dropped the microphone on that. Thank you so much, CK. Barbara, what comes next?
Every one of us has to be a democracy champion. If we're not, then we are abandoning the battlefield for our justice. Women cannot have the representation and the rights and the leadership if we don't fight for it. And we must pass in this generation, just like our mighty ancestors, our mighty forebears, some of them still alive, passed the Civil Rights Act of 64, Voting Rights Act of 65, Fair Housing Act, set forth the Equal Pay Act, all these things, they did that. We have to pass S1, the For the People Act. We must pass the HR 4, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, 250 bills pending right now in 43 states to destroy American democracy. It is our imperative. We got to stand up. May 8th, be part of that. Go to votingrightsalliance.org, sign up, join us. I mean, there's nothing more than, you talk about women's leadership. Leadership is in what you do. You got to lead. You got to be part of the movement. That's how we build. That's how we create. That's how we reproduce. That's how we do all the mighty actions that we must do. And that's by being in motion. We will pass the ERA because we'll fight to get it done. And so all of these fights are interlinked, but they're all based on our direct action, our direct involvement. Get involved, folks. Be the leader. You'll find out. I became a leader because I started doing stuff. Didn't intend to be a leader. Never did. But people made me a leader because I was active. Get involved, people.
Thank you so much, Barbara. Julie, what comes next?
So while we're fighting all the fights that Barbara and CK have already mentioned, we need to rewrite the rules of the game.
Yes.
Many of the rules under which we operate, electoral rules, amendment rules for our Constitution, and the rules by which the Senate operates, such as the filibuster, have a long history of being written with entrenching a particular vision that is not compatible with the full participation of women and women of color. And so until we change the rules of the game, the fight is going to be a lot harder than it should be.
And Susan Herman. Susan, what comes next?
Well, first, I want to totally agree with everything that everybody's just been saying. But for the ACLU, what comes next is continuing the work of Crystal Eastman and Ruth Bader Ginsburg and working on the preconditions for women's leadership, which are basic equality. While women don't have equal pay, while there's pregnancy discrimination, while women are fighting against violence and harassment, and you can look at the ACLU website for the new vision of gender justice. But it's very hard to be a leader when you're worrying all the time about whether you're going to have a home or whether you're going to be safe, or et cetera. So there's a tremendous amount of work to be done there to try to put women in a position where they're going to be able to even think about being leadership and not just trying to sustain their lives. The last thing I think I want to say is that the current director of the Women's Rights Project, which somebody once called the house that Ruth built, for you baseball fans, is Ria Tobacco Mar, who is not white and came out of the LGBT project at the ACLU. So she has a really interesting agenda. And I think one case that I'll mention to you, which is a real follow-up on the work that Ginsburg did, there's a current case called National Coalition of Men, which involves why men and not women have to register for the draft. So the work that Ginsburg has done is just not over. We still have so much inequity in the country, and some of it, I think, you get to lead by leading and by the power of women, by women being fierce. But some of it, I think, is if women are at a disadvantage, if they're handicapped by starting 6 paces behind because they're not going to be paid the same for the same work, et cetera, the ACLU is working on trying to, tear down those obstacles.
Susan, thank you so much. And I'd like to thank all of our guests who've joined us today and have offered such incredible wisdom and insight on the matters that they've worked on, and have also given us some personal reflection too in terms of their own experiences. This concludes this 4-part series that we have done on advancing women's equality. And I want to thank Barbara Arnwine, Susan Herman, C.K. Hoffler, Julie Sook. I want to thank my colleagues at the ACLU of Minnesota. As you see in the chat, you can support the work of the ACLU of Minnesota by going to aclu-min.org and then /donate in order to show and lift up your support for the organization. And this is a critical time for advancing conversations about women's leadership that are intersectional as well. And we conclude this program while the trial of Officer Chauvin takes place in the aftermath of the killing of women who were AAPI in Atlanta, Georgia, a mass shooting in Boulder, Colorado, just a week or 2 ago, and a kind of rise of hate against Asian Americans that is really appalling. We are a big community and a big net. And when we think about advancing women's equality, we think about it in intersectional ways. I want to thank you all for joining us for these programs, and I wish you a wonderful end to Women's History Month. Thank you all so much. And thank you too to our ASL interpreters who've been with us for each of these programs. Thank you very much for joining us today, Debbie.